This is the 31st Edina Reads program that the Edina Library and the Edina Community Foundation have worked together on to bring to the Edina community since they began the program in October 2005. And the woman who thought of Edina Reads is sitting here. She is now happily retired, Marcia Watson, right back there. We're glad to have her here. She partnered with Dick Crockett of the Edina Foundation to begin this. And I was really glad that Dick found these little details. Lonnie Skrentner was elected to the Edina School Board in 2009 after retiring from her teaching position at Edina High School in 2007. Lonnie was a beloved teacher at the Edina High School and is remembered with great affection by both students and parents. Her family moved to Edina in 1991, and her two children graduated from Edina schools in 1996 and 2000. She still does volunteer tutoring for the Edina Better Chance and the Choice is Yours students at the high school. She is also an active member of the Edina League of Women Voters. I want to thank the Edina League of Women Voters for partnering with the Edina Reads Committee, the Edina Community Foundation, and the Friends of the Edina Library, who have all made this evening possible to honor September 11th, Patriot Day. The League's Suzanne Kerwin worked very hard to make the community aware of this program. Patriot Day asks Americans to look and think forward as our hearts and memories are pulled back to that tragic Tuesday morning in New York City 11 years ago. I'm very happy to introduce Lonnie Skrentner.
Let us all stand, please. Let's take a moment of silence to recognize this day as the 11th anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the brave passengers of Flight 93 who saved other lives at another target at the cost of their own lives. Thank you. Many of you in this room know me as very much a political animal with strong convictions. But tonight I'm here with my League of Women Voters hat on. And that hat has taught me the value of consensus, the value of listening, as well as speaking with conviction. Those of you who know me as a teacher know that I can speak as if I believe just about anything, including being a slave owner or playing the role of George W. Bush. Anything to make my students think, which has always forced me to consider all of the possible sides to anything, which is essentially what Parker Palmer wants us to do. I ask all of us tonight to think outside of ourselves, to use Palmer's ideas to allow our hearts to break, not shattering into pieces, but open to ideas that we haven't thought about before, or maybe that we've heard and rather quickly rejected. Everyone needs to feel welcome here tonight. And believe me, I have struggled to put together a program that I hope will allow us to rise above the hyperpartisanship in which we live. I want each of you to think about meeting at least one stranger tonight, someone that you didn't know when you walked through the door. When we form small groups, I encourage you to move away from the people that you came with, and even maybe away from the people that you've been sitting with for the last 20 minutes and chatting with. Tonight we need to be what Parker calls a company of strangers. Citizens coming together, perhaps like those early Edinans in the Grange Hall nearly 125 years ago. Each of us has a different history. I'm not a native Edinan, and I take grief for that. Everybody has a different personality. I can't wait to talk, and some people are quiet. But the bottom line is that we share a commitment to this community of Edina. We share the values of strong families and excellent education. And we all have those personal stories that if we are willing to share, they may break open our hearts, making us willing to consider different ways of thinking. I want us to think about tonight, we the people, to focus on us. Palmer doesn't ask us to dial down our differences. He cites the fact that only 39 out of 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed that document. That means 30 of them walked out the door. They didn't dial down their differences. They walked out their door and they led the anti-ratification effort. And when they lost that, they formed the first political party, the Democratic Republicans, in order to try and keep the new, stronger national government as weak as possible. Palmer asks us to become intentional rather than accidental citizens. As I look around this room, I'm going to ask a question because it's often hard to tell. Do we have naturalized citizens in the room? A few, okay. But for most of us, that citizenship is a birthright. And we take it pretty much for granted. And Palmer asks us to become more intentional about our citizenship. We live in an award-winning community. So what does this have to do with us? The bottom line is our goal is to think about ways to maintain that community and maybe to even make it better. And so I ask you again to consider this a calling back to the Grange Hall, where citizens founded our community and aired their differences and created the community that we live in today. To really discuss the ideas of the book, we have to take Palmer at his nonviolent Quaker best, which for me is really hard. Don't say yes, but. Right now, in your head, I want you to take the word but out of your vocabulary for the next hour and a half. And I know how hard that is. Instead, to say yes and. So, yeah, I hear you, instead of but, and I want to add. I want us to consider not just a private and a political life, but a public life that's someplace in between. Forums such as this are part of a public life. So are Facebook. So are high school football games in Edina, at least, where you can walk through the gates and see everybody from age 90 to age crawling. And we're all there to cheer for the high school football team. July 4th in this community is public life with orchestra and fireworks. Public life, according to Palmer, is part of democracy. And I haven't thought about this, but even a totalitarian society has a private and a political life. But that's a place where public life is dangerous. We tend to use public and political as synonyms. And today we need to get away from that. The Star Tribune has really been helpful to me the last couple of weeks as I've been working on this, because there was an article about public life titled Freedom of Assembly and We Meet Again. And lo and behold, it was on the front of the variety section. Just to read the beginning of it. After Tess Gallagher moved to Minneapolis for a new job, the 24-year-old Michigan graduate didn't try to make friends at the gym or the grocery store. Instead, she logged on to meetup.com, where she found 3 groups whose members shared her eclectic interests: reading, rock climbing, and theater. And she found 3 groups to go live a public life with, and to join and to meet people and to learn about the differences that Parker Palmer calls our most valuable assets. I want to spend about 15 minutes or so talking about the basics of Palmer. We're going to take a look at focus questions and then divide into small groups. Spend a half an hour to 40 minutes in those small groups choosing questions. I mean, I'm one of those teachers, I got way too many questions. And rather than my saying, these are the two we're going to discuss and that's your life, I left them all on the sheet and your group can choose. And I think that should work. And then we will come back towards the end of the evening and return to the large group for debriefing and for suggestions. We have Val Burke with us tonight, if she'll raise her hand. She's the head of our community education department. And if you are interested in continuing this kind of dialogue on real issues, what sorts of topics might you like to discuss as a community? And are you willing, through perhaps community ed, to come together once a quarter, once every 6 weeks, whatever, when you have time, and not that you're saying you will always be there, but is that something that we might want to do as a community? Is that another piece of public life that we could add to the community of Edina? Number one, thank you all for being here. I read Parker Palmer's book several years ago when it first came out, and I loved it. And so when I was asked to do this, I didn't have any problem saying yes. We do live in one of the most hyper-partisan eras of U.S. history. And I didn't really think about that until one of my last years of teaching, when, as we were reviewing for the AP test and talking about politics and political leadership, and some smart mouth in the back of the room said, "Has it ever been this bad?" And I stopped. I said, "That's a good question." And the first decade that came to mind did not make me very happy, because the first thing I thought of was the 1850s. And I said, yeah, it was that bad, and we ended up shooting each other. Not what I have in mind for the present. But the bottom line is that most of us grew up in the least partisan era of U.S. history, the post-World War II time frame. And most other eras were about as knocked down, drag 'em out, ugly as the one we're living in now. And lo and behold, again, the dear sweet Star Tribune came through on Saturday, September 1st. Ugly politics, question mark? They set the standard. And lo and behold, who's the they? Our founding fathers. And I'll have to admit, I used to use this as the example in my classroom, the election of 1800, when both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams literally bought newspapers, hired their own editors, and pretty much told them what to write. In a Jefferson's newspaper, Adams was, quote, a hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Now, in an Adams newspaper, Jefferson was, quote, a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto mother. Jefferson's papers called Adams a wannabe monarch plotting to destroy democracy. Team Adams, in response, said that Jefferson would import the guillotine and sow French-style chaos. Their vision of a Jefferson presidency looked like, quote, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood. You gotta love it. The Federalists warned in pamphlets that if the, quote, open infidel were elected, he would buttress his, quote, contemptuous fling at the blessed Jesus by shuttering churches. They also said he was going to collect all the Bibles. And then, on Inauguration Day, the victorious Jefferson got up and said, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are dreary things. Guess what? We're going to hear the same thing in January. And the pleas will go as unheeded as they were in 1800. But as this author says, Dick Pullman from the Philadelphia Inquirer, that's okay. We'll survive just as we ever have since our founding angels schemed like demons, is the way he put it. I want to talk about the basics of Palmer. I know that many of you in the room have read the book. Many of you have not. Some of you have read bits and pieces of it. All of you should have a pink sheet that has the 5 habits of the heart. But what's not on that sheet is the whole concept of heart as a core. We tend to think of heart today as emotion. That's the way we use the word. But Palmer wants us to go back to an older definition where the heart is not just emotion, but it includes our intellect, our cognition, and it includes our problem solving. So that it's not a matter, and this is Palmer again, of heart versus head. It's heart and head together. And I'm going to put this idea first. Palmer has, and he presents first, his 5 habits of the heart that you have in front of you. But at the end, he says, if you really want to boil my message down to 2 words, the 2 words are chutzpah and humility. And you know, he moves them after, but I want to put them first because I think it's always good. And I think we all know, chutzpah is that courage to speak, to go ahead and do it. Humility, on the other hand, is the power to listen, to sit back and to absorb what someone else has to say and to be able to say, I hadn't thought about it that way before, and to actually take the time to think. He talks then about what we can do as individual citizens and as small communities. And he talks about listening to children. He talks about schools offering opportunities to explore differences. And I think that the Edina Public Schools do concentrate on that, do encourage students to look beyond themselves. This is one I think we all have trouble with. He says we can ask questions of people with whom we disagree. It's so much easier in our hyper-partisan era, as somebody speaking, to be plotting in your head what it is you're going to say back. Instead, Palmer would say to you, no, listen to them and think of a question that you can ask them to expand on what they've said, so that, Lord forbid, you have to listen again. He says, try to make our religious congregations safe for diversity, to ask those kinds of questions, to keep, and lastly, to keep the critics in the conversation. And this is one of the things, and this is, I always used to say in my classroom, this is Screntner talking, I don't have any resources behind me. But I really feel that in today's society, because of the internet, websites, cable stations, we can now pick and choose. We don't have to listen to everybody. We can listen only to the people we agree with, and Palmer, and I think most people would argue that really isn't good. You know, you're not being an intentional citizen when you do that. Parker has 5 habits of the heart. Number 1, we are all in this together. We need to remember the preamble to our Constitution, which ends with the words, promote the general welfare. Public good, common good, those are words that have floated out of our vocabulary in this era of hyperpartisanship. And one of the ways to ease that hyperpartisanship is to get back to them. His second one is hard. It's to develop an appreciation of otherness. This is the humility piece of his 2-word boiled down message. that I see value. And he actually says that our differences are our most valuable assets. And I want you to think about that. You know, and we often say it without thinking. Man, if everybody was the same, it'd be really boring. And that's true. But we don't really live it necessarily. He even admits that this is really tough because we are tribal by nature. I mean, we started as tribal people who needed a tribe in order to survive. And it had to be your tribe versus the other tribes, because survival was actually at stake. His third one is the one that I had the most difficulty even understanding. He says, cultivate the ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. And I think I've thought of two good examples that make that real. One is, most of us in this room, many of us are parents or we're children. You know, we had to get here somehow. And think of both disciplining and loving your child at the same time. You have to do that. But that's a tension. You know, and we all know the parent who says, oh, well, I can't do that to my kid because I just love them too much. And we think, no, you don't love them enough. Discipline them. But that is a tension. And when your child looks at you and says, I hate you, you're so mean, doesn't feel good. But I'm willing to bet that every parent in the room has heard those words, at least if they've disciplined their child. More in line with tonight to, think about the fact that our founders intentionally created 3 branches of government. Can you define tension in one easy word? Woo, let's think about Congress and the President and the Supreme Court. You know, we got to get them perhaps to hold that tension in a more creative fashion. Fourth, to generate a sense of personal voice and urgency. Here comes the chutzpah. And tonight, as you move into small groups, it'll probably take you about 45 seconds to figure out who the quiet people in your group are and who the mouthy ones are, like me. And I ask you to work on encouraging the chutzpah of the quiet folk. Not an easy thing necessarily to do. His 5th habit of the heart is to strengthen our capacity to create a community. And I really think that if we can do the first 4 habits, we do the 5th. If we can value our differences, if we can speak with conviction and listen and value that otherness, we will, and we have. I mean, this is one of the things that Edina has done. The farmers versus the town folks. Farmers and the town folk. You know, from the very outset of this community, I think that we have done that. Think about those 5 habits of the heart. Can you tell that I'm not used to using a microphone? Yeah. I'm used to just using my teacher voice. All right, tonight we're going to divide into small groups for we're going to try probably 35 minutes. And it looks like we can probably all be in this room somewhere. I think an ideal group is probably 4 to 6 people, a variety of ages and stations in life. There are a bunch of League of Women Voters members here who have buttons on, and I've asked them to scatter themselves around. There are a bunch of school personnel, because the schools are also concentrating on this book this year. And that hopefully what you do is that you go into a group with people that you don't know. Now, of course, if you're Dick Crockett and you know everybody in the room, No, not true? Okay, even you can meet somebody tonight? Okay, because I know Dick knows just about everybody. You're going to get a sheet. We'll leave these questions up, and I'll have Claude pass out a sheet to each of the groups. So we'll leave the screen up. I would say read through the questions, and hopefully someone with chutzpah is going to say, I really like the fourth one. Let's start there. And because we're following Parker's rules, we're not going to go, well, I don't want to talk about that one. We're going to say, okay, why does that strike you as a good question to start with? We're going to ask a question about the question. Which habit, the first one is really easy. I mean, I think anybody can do that with the pink sheet. Which habit of the heart resonated most with you? Or if you're a person who actually read the book, the whole book, and there's something in that book that, you know, where there was a paragraph that you just really fell in love with and you marked it and you want to share it with everybody else. Number two, how is it that our differences are the most valuable assets? Because we are tribal by nature. And tribes tend to say, you will be like everyone else. We might say it starts in teendom, but not really. What do you consider essential parts of what Palmer refers to as democracy's infrastructure? What is it that we need to make sure are solid in order for democracy to continue? He says it's things like government institutions and schools and churches. I mean, he sees just about everything that we belong to as a piece of democratic infrastructure. Number four, how does the American myth affect the use of habits of the heart? How can we allow interaction between myth and reality? And this one is in a sense, in my mind, one of the biggest pieces of the hyper-partisanship today. And I want to go through a little bit of it. If you have a book and you like to follow along, I'm on page 176, where Parker Palmer says, myth is a tricky word. People often interpret it as meaning an outright lie, as in, we kids were told Dad was stationed overseas when in fact he was in prison. Or a sincere but untrue belief when it is taken literally, as in, our founders agreed on everything. Rightly understood, a myth is an effort to tell truths that cannot be told with mere facts or known by the senses and the mind alone. Truth that takes form only in the integrative place called the heart. So you have to use all those pieces of your heart to understand myths. And every nation has myths, including us. And I'm moving to page 179, where he talks about the first few lines of the Declaration as one of our enduring myths in American history. Many of us do know those lines by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thus was created an American myth, perhaps the American myth in two senses of the word. On the one hand, the people who wrote those words and the nation they founded fell far short of their own declaration. The founders excluded many men and all women from the blessings of liberty. And in this sense, America's founding myth is a flat-out lie. On the other hand, the myth expresses an aspiration, without which America would not be the nation that it is today. Our desire to be a nation that honors human equality has proved so powerful that we have been compelled to pursue it for nearly 2.5 centuries, a task that will probably continue to occupy us as long as this nation exists. So Palmer asks us to look at myth as aspiration, not as reality. 5, in your opinion, how might we apply these ideas in this book to the community of Edina? The last 3 are kind of more specific, and I just left them there because I dreamt them up and I didn't want to cut them out. How does the internet affect the politics of the heart? You know, in my mind, that's one of the ways that allows us to just live in a tunnel. How does the internet affect community? And I might have said, oh, in a very negative fashion until I read that article about meetup.com. What can we as citizens do about what is a very apparent closed heart of our media? The fact that media has carved out partisan spots in which to put themselves, and they make a lot of money that way. Lastly, the whole idea of being a reflective citizen. This is something that as teachers we try very hard to teach students, and it's not easy. Because none of us like to question ourselves or think about our thinking. To be self-critical is to be reflective. If you read the very first pages of the book, Palmer admits that this book came to him in a dark time as he suffered one of his bouts of clinical depression. And as I read the book, there were parts of the book that made me more reflective than others, that made me stop and go, ooh, yeah, ooh, and oftentimes made me uncomfortable with myself and my actions. Is there a part of the book that made you reflective? And then what does the ability to be reflective have to do with democracy, which is something that Palmer really doesn't talk about at all? Okay. Basic questions about operation. All right, it's time to rise. Everybody get up. Everybody has to change chairs because you've been sitting for 45 minutes anyway. All right, we would like, I think we have time for each group to share one kernel, and then to think a little bit about whether we have unanswered questions, whether there are other pieces of public life that we might be able to add to our community of Edina. I did hear some of the tables talking about the concept of defining neighborhoods, and in a sense how polarizing that has been. An example of the hyperpartisanship that exists in society, and yet the whole focus on defining those neighborhoods is to create another space. Once again, Parker Palmer's rules that we listen to each other and we hold the tension in silence for a while as we listen to each group, and I want you to think about what kind of a question might you ask this group based on their kernel of glory they're sharing with us.
Oh, I get 2 mics here.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Hope Melton, and I think our group would like to ask, Edina is becoming rapidly and broadly a much more diverse community. And how can we engage the whole community across generations in welcoming and valuing that diversity?
Okay, hello, I'm Cassidy Labe, and I think the overall question or point that my group want to make is how, as we as a community, can let down the walls around our private life and really, expand, not through the internet, but beyond the internet, and lead more, face-to-face debates, face-to-face interactions with the people around us.
I am using my minute of fame. Lonnie was so nice earlier to introduce me, Val Burke with Edina Community Ed with the public schools, and we talked a lot about how does this book apply to Edina, and I would like to invite anyone and everyone here. You can contact me through Edina Community Education Services. I did put some sheets around to say your name and phone number. If there's aspects of this that you'd like to continue this conversation or get into deeper conversation about the 5 habits, we would love to continue that, because I think loved what you've had to say, but the season of democracy is so important, and especially as our community continues to change and evolve, it's important for everyone here to be a part of the discussion. So if you can, sign up and give me your name, contact me, or I'll contact you. I know many of you here, so that's that. Thank you.
Hi. one?
No, you got to have both.
Oh, well.
Yeah, you got to be
then I
double.
get twice as much time to talk. We had a very interesting conversation, and we did talk about the neighborhoods and the rationale for choosing neighborhoods, why we would do that, and the possible negative or positive context that might happen. But we also talked about agreeing to disagree and the essence of having civility about disagreeing, what the rules and boundaries are about disagreeing, and also asking questions. I personally like that idea about asking questions if you're with someone and you don't agree with them or understand what they're saying, is really learning how to ask I questions and not you questions. And my plug is, in Edina Reads, we hope from the Human Rights Commission to have a feature book on bullying in April. I think we have a date already.
Super.
So we want to see you back then.
Hi, my name is Luann Waddick, and our group, first of all, we agreed that we're all in it together. But we were talking about number 2, how our differences are most valuable assets, and how we each find it hard to figure that out. We all said that we are guilty of dismissing somebody else, their idea quickly because we think we're right. And how can we learn to listen with open mind more? And what else was it? Oh, shoot. There were a few other things. I'm so nervous up here. One of the things we talked about, well, what is a difference? Sometimes when the politicians are speaking, I seem to think, or some of us said, that they're telling a lie and something that's not true and not a fact. So is that just that we have a difference of opinion, or is what we're talking about not true? So that we didn't come up with a conclusion on how to figure that out. Thank you.
No, and let's face it, listening to what Jefferson and Adams had to say about each other, both of those sides were lying as low as a bed.
Hi, my name is Kevin Staunton. Our group talked about a number of things, but I'd like to just mention a couple. One, in terms of how the differences make us better. I have served on the Planning Commission here in Edina for the last several years, and I am constantly astonished at how I can go through my packet before a meeting, think that I have the answer on any given agenda item, and I show up at the meeting and somebody says something, one of my colleagues, that I hadn't thought of and I never would have thought of. And part of what makes us all better is that we benefit from those different perspectives. So that was one of the things we talked about. The other thing we talked about was this whole notion of creative tension. And while there is a part of it that is this idea of holding two contradictory thoughts at the same time, there's also a part of it that's emphasizing the tension part that makes you a little uncomfortable, that sometimes it's necessary to have a little more temperature in the room to get yourself a little off balance, as Rachel put it, to have disequilibrium, and that we can't sometimes learn or grow or have new revelations unless we have that kind of tension. So those were two of the highlights of our discussion.
Hi, I'm Joelle Reiling. I'm a teacher at the high school in the English department. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was asked to be the spokesperson for our group. I shared with the group towards the end that in the English department, if some of you don't know, we have a common course for all 10th graders now, which means that we have an inclusive environment. We're not tracking the students, or students don't go into an honors or an enriched or an AP class, but we teach to an AP level and differentiate our instruction. And that sort of went along with the tenor of our conversation, which revolved around interconnectivity. How do we foster that in our community? How do we foster an inclusive environment? And sort of stemming from that, we also realize that schools are a real political place, a place where democracy can or cannot exist. And we talked about how that was also sort of, when you're not involved with a school, how do you be democratic in a community? I mean, you can vote, but in a town like Edina, Jane, one of the women in my group, she shared that it was sort of, she felt like she didn't have an organization to belong to where she could have a voice in the way that some of the students might have a voice in our school or something like that. And so we just sort of pondered that and thought about that for a while.
Thank you. I'll make a plug right following that for the League of Women Voters as an organization that everyone, and even though we still call ourselves the League of Women Voters, men are eligible for full membership. We're not.
I'm Mary Yee, and our group started out by talking about tribalism, and I think we kind of got into talking about how our tribalistic tendencies make it difficult to appreciate the value of the other. And something that came up was the exercise of the imagination that philosopher John Rawls asked us to exercise, which is that what kind of a world would we create? What kind of systems or policies would we enact if we were all hidden behind a veil of ignorance and we didn't know what our station in life would be? So a difficult exercise, I think, but we thought that it might carry us some ways down the road.
Hi, I'm Bill McCabe. Our group settled on the third item, ability to hold tension in life-giving ways, and while we covered a lot of territory, we settled in on a way to overcome the potential for conflict, is to find common ground rather than to jump into the divisive issues and work through the things that are less divisive to find some peace.
So our group, we had a good discussion, and we started out with how we might apply the book to Edina, and we're contrasting how things used to be done with regards to electing city officials or the school district making decisions, and how things are done now, and we agreed that there's more input from the community invited and more community participation both in the city and the schools for making decisions. And then we got into how does American myth affect the use of the habits of the heart. We are just getting going on that one. That'd be a good discussion, and we agreed that the American myths, and we saw those as aspirations of from the frontiersman to entrepreneurial spirit, pull yourself up with hard work, to taking care of everybody. You know, we're a community and we take care of each other, and that's where the tension lies.
And since she didn't introduce herself, that's Suzanne Kerwin, who is the past president of the League of Women Voters.
I'm Joni Bennett. I'm on the Edina City Council, and I'm also a leaguer, although I don't have the really nice button this evening. And I was with a group of teachers. We covered a number of topics and kept circling back to the importance, the value of appreciating otherness. And some of the challenges to that are lack of time, media overload. If you're on Facebook or you're dealing with one news source, how do you deal with others, even contemplate or take in other sources of information. And it was agreed, or there was consensus, that it was important to have curiosity about others and the differences of, in our society, to be sensitive to differences as we're communicating with other people, and to have respect for the people that we're communicating. The value of that in imparting our own opinions as well as hearing the opinions of others, because people want to be respected in that dialogue. That was a clear emphasis of the discussion.
I'm Linda Lewis, and I'm retired for whatever. Yeah, it was a big deal. We talked about the way things are now and the way things used to be, but a few points. Our beliefs, that things we believe are not always the truth, and our community is global now, and so the diversity, we are more diverse than ever. And someone had the example of their church invited a homeless person family into their church to really get to know them and what they deal with and they stayed with them for a week, and to really get to know them on a personal basis. And someone else mentioned that they had a person of color into their family, married into their family, and they really had to face their prejudices if they had one, but that it was real freeing when they came to the conclusion to accept the person. It was very freeing. So that's mainly what we talked about, the diversity issue.
Hi, I'm Brianna Bellows. So we talked about point 3, and more specifically, we talked about how we have the freedom to voice our opinions, especially with so many different representatives here. We actually have Mr. Josh Sprague, I hope I said his name right, at our table. And so it was really nice talking to him, and we just talked about how we elect our representatives and have the opportunity to be an informed voter, and how we can push that extra 5% to inform, kids my age, the new generation of voters. And he gave us his email on how we can get that information, but me and my friend Gigi, suggested, make a Facebook page, because let's face it, we're on there all day anyway, so we would for sure see it, especially if they were in the Edina network. So yeah, that's what we talked about.
All right, someone forgot to say something. I'm supposed to say there is, if you are on Facebook, there is a public life called PI, Politics in Edina, and if you Google it up at the top, you can like the page, and then you get the posts, and it's at times very partisan. But it's very interesting. And maybe if some of us who are here tonight start commenting on PI, the discussions may change a little bit. We are, sorry to say, out of time. And I know that we could go on and talk about, what can we do? And so I think Val's offer of continuing this discussion is enormously important, and I hope that lots of us sign up to do that. I want to announce tonight that the League of Women Voters has monthly, what we call unit meetings. And in October, our speaker is going to be Superintendent Rick Dressen, and he's going to be talking about supporting the school's evolving community of learners, so that he's going to take that difference piece and extend what we've been talking about here tonight. And all of the League meetings are open to the public. It's Thursday, October 11th, 9:45 in the morning, and Saturday, October 13th at 9:45 in the morning, both of them. So, and the League of Women Voters of Edina has a website. We also have a Facebook page. Thursday is at the Edina Community Center in room 349, and October 13th, Saturday, is at Edina City Hall. Well, yes, we do have September meetings this Thursday and Saturday. I have a feeling most people's calendars are probably pretty set by now. At least I know mine is. I want to finish tonight just very quickly. I think a lot of our people who came up said this in different words. We can't take democracy for granted. It's not a given. It's not something that never goes away or that can't go away. And if we do not become the intentional citizens that Parker Palmer talks about, he talks about citizenship light. And he says, that's voting. That's right. He even considers writing letters to the editor citizenship light, and donating to candidates as citizenship light. That if you are not truly down in the weeds and in the issues, you're not being a truly intentional citizen. And so that's something for all of us to consider. And as Maureen started us off, she said that we are meeting here on what people have decided to call Patriots' Day. And I always told my students in history class that if you could look at your country, warts and all, you could acknowledge the points at which we were not on the moral side, and come out saying, I still don't want to be anything but an American, that then you were more of a patriot, in my book, than the people who simply decided that the myth was real, and thus they were a patriot. So I leave you with that thought tonight. Palmer wants us to deal with reality, and that's what we need to do. Thank you so much for being here today and for being such great participators.